Over the years, you can see this has increased dramatically. We've gone up. We're now at over 34,000 pages of environmental regulations that we might have to deal with. And you can see the red line here is what's under the Clean Air Act, and that's why Eric is going to provide a whole separate section on Clean Air Act permitting. It is one of the bigger liabilities we might have to deal with. And to put this into perspective, they always hear people complaining about how complicated the tax code is. There's roughly 15,000 pages of federal tax code regulations. For environmental, we're over twice that level. So I don't want to talk too much about the politics here. We could spend a lot of time on that. I work with Jess and the NGFA trying to repeal some of these regulations and address them. But the real important item, the intent of this presentation that we need to get out of this is ways to avoid liabilities, maintain compliance, and then I'll talk a lot about schedule and timing, how that can help you achieve that. Liabilities associated with environmental regulations are huge. Under the Clean Air Act alone, they can fine you $37,500 a day per violation. So if you would start construction without an air permit that you needed, they could come in, not only could they shut you down, but they could fine you that amount for every day you were constructing. And I've worked with some major companies, and they didn't heed our advice, and I've seen the Corps of Engineers issue cease and desist letters to facilities for starting construction without completing all their wetlands permitting. So it's a serious issue that you have to deal with. Fortunately, a lot of this can be taken care of if you just allow for proper scheduling and timing. That's the only problem with environmental regulations is some of them have really long lead times. The previous presenter mentioned that safety starts at the planning stage. The exact same thing goes for environmental. And I'll discuss some of the timing issues that'll help you achieve compliance as you go along your project. So in our group, we've come up with timelines for various types of projects. We've got acquisitions where we're going to buy a company, and we've got certain things we're going to do for those, certain timelines we're going to meet. We have renovations and retrofits and demolitions. They're a whole different set of timelines. And then we have organic or greenfield projects where we're starting on a bare piece of ground. We're going to build a grain elevator. We probably have the most permits with the greenfield or organic projects. So I chose that one to walk through all the different things that we might address as we're building a grain elevator. And this is an example timeline. You can see it could take up to 16 months to walk through all these. Now this would depend on the type of grain elevator you're building, the state you're in, and you can expedite this process if you plan ahead of time. And you don't always have to do each of these for every project, but they're things that you might need to address. And we start way at the top. You can address a lot of these issues before you even buy or select the property that you're trying to build on. I've done this when I was in consulting for a lot of companies. Some of them call it a fatal flaw analysis, others a desktop survey. It's something that doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't take a lot of effort, but we might run through all of these different items before we even decide on what property we're going to buy. Fortunately, with the availability of online sources, and my favorite, you can upload a lot of Google Earth layers. So I can sit at my desk, I can zero in on a property, and I can find out a lot of environmental issues associated with that site in a matter of minutes. One of the first things that we might check are the Federal Emergency Management Agency requirements for floods. See if we're in a flood hazard area. This is an example of a Google Earth layer you can get, where you can actually see whether your area is in a flood hazard or what flood hazard zone it's in. It's really important because this can greatly increase the cost of a project. If you have to build up to a higher elevation, your costs are going to go up. And one of the bigger issues that you'll see nowadays is the Corps of Engineers has a program called the 408 permit. And if you're building near a levee, even if you're not on that levee, you may have to go through that permitting process. And that can take up to a year and a half and require some extensive studies. So it's important to try to vet that up ahead of time. You may not preclude a property because of its proximity, but you may need to take into account the fact that you're going to have additional time and costs associated with that one. The National Park Service has a National Registry of Historic Places. I also have a Google Earth layer for this. Now, most of these sites are buildings and structures that we don't tend to be building on or near, but there are a few that are just grounds in greenfield areas that might be archaeological sites. They might have found something there years ago. So I don't find these very often, but if you do run across them, they're not well delineated, so if you're anywhere near them, you may run into issues, and I'll talk about that later. Threatened endangered species. There's a federal fish and wildlife agency, and then the name for the state agencies with responsibility for that varies a lot. It could be the Department of Natural Resources, Fish and Game and Parks. What you're looking for here are critical habitat for threatened and endangered species. Now, they don't have this listed for every state and every species. A few states have some good information. Nebraska happens to be one of them. They have a list of, or they have maps with critical habitat. And if you are going to be doing construction in any one of these areas where there's critical habitat, you should coordinate that very early on, because threatened and endangered species, you can usually get around them if you time it correctly. They all have different times in which you could build. They'll either have a nesting season, roosting, denning, pupping, mating, you name it. It's different for every single one of them, but if you figure out when that is, there are certain times that you can go ahead and do construction, and once you've constructed, generally you're good to go. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And we laugh a lot about this, and I get harassed a lot when I have to do threatened and endangered species, and it might delay a project. But it's really important to note that you have to take these seriously. If you don't know what this is this infamous threatened and endangered species called the snail darter. In 1973, this fish species held up the Tennessee Valley Authority's Teleco Dam for 6 years. They had built and spent $100 million on that project when this issue came up. And after going all the way to the Supreme Court, they finally ended up transplanting a number of these fish to a different area, and they were able to finally complete construction. So you can imagine, though, the havoc this would create if you're trying to build a grain elevator and you had to wait 6 years. And obviously you might have a few legal fees if you have to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Most of the grain elevators we're building aren't very water-intensive projects, but if you're also going to have fertilizer operations or going to be doing grain processing, you may have to have a good source of water. This has become a problem of late. Fortunately, we've had a lot of rain in the Midwest and the Southwest that's alleviated some of this issue, but something you may want to look into ahead of time. There are a number of sites out there, it varies by state, but you can find out well information to find out depth of wells, how far you might have to go to get water, and then you can also find out how much water is available. There are some places where just because you own the property doesn't mean you can draw the water out from that well. You may have to purchase water rights for that area, which can increase the cost of your project. And finally, the wetland desktop survey. Some people refer to this as a wetland determination. You can't formally determine if there's a wetland on your property without actually going out and having a wildlife biologist inspect the area and look at the plants, and I'll talk about that. But you can get a good idea if you're going to have issues by doing some desktop surveys. One of the items you look at are topographical maps. So if the topographic map shows any signs of water on the site, even if when you're at the site you don't see anything, that's a sign that there might be hydrology, which is one of the indicators of a wetland. So you typically check out the topographic maps. The Fish and Wildlife Service has national wetland inventory maps. You can get a layer for this. If you have a highlighted area on here that indicates a wetland, the onus is on you to prove that it's either not a wetland or it's not jurisdictional. And it's not uncommon. They pretty much did flyovers to determine if, and did reflectivity tests to see if there was water on the site. So these aren't 100%. They could have just had a heavy rain that day. But I can guarantee you a regulator is going to look at these maps, and they're going to want you to prove that it's not a wetland on your property. You can also check soil survey maps. And sometimes people do this as a geotechnical investigation, and that's often done as a fatal flaw analysis too, because You can imagine depending upon the footings and things, geotechnical stabilization you need, your costs can also increase there. Now, this will only tell you the surface soils, but you can actually go in and determine if these soils are good for wetland plants. You can go in, you can click on the soil, look at the type, and then it'll even tell you if it's what they call a hydric soil or has a hydric rating. And so if you have hydric soils in the site, that's a sign, too, that you might have wetlands there. So that's everything you might do before you even select the property you're going to get. But before you buy that property, one of the things you might want to do is a Phase 1 environmental site assessment. Typically hire a consultant to do this because there are certain minimum criteria, qualifications that they need to have. And we typically do this 1 month to 180 days before you buy the property. So one thing a lot of people don't know is under the environmental liability rules that we have, you could be held liable for the cleanup of that property, which could be millions of dollars, even if you had nothing to do with it. You bought property that had some contamination in it, and you didn't contribute to that contamination or cause any of it. You could even be held liable if your neighboring facility had contamination that migrated onto your property. Now, they don't typically go after people for that, but they legally can, according to the regulations. So to protect you from that, you do a Phase 1 environmental site assessment. What this does is it checks to see if there's any indication of potential contamination on the property. They'll do a database search, which is what's shown up here, that might show if there are any listings of spills, leaks, releases nearby. They're going to interview the property owner, local government officials. And the reason why you need to do this about a month before you buy the property is you're supposed to interview and get responses from the local government officials, and they're not always timely. Sometimes you can get it done more quickly than 28 days. And the report itself is only good for 180 days, so if you do it too soon, you might have to do it again. Once you've bought the property, but before you start breaking ground, there are a lot of items you might need to take care of well in advance of potential construction projects before you actually break ground. One of the biggest that Eric will touch on even more are the air construction permits. There are a lot of different types of permits out there. It depends on the state and the project, but it could take up to 180 days to get the permit. Some states have statutory limits on how long it takes. Like Illinois says once you give them a complete application, they have to give it to you in 90 days. And, of course, I've done permitting there, and, of course, it took 90 days exactly. They finally sent me that permit application. Other states have other statutory limits, but what you'll see happen is that limit doesn't start until they've given you a complete application. And what they'll do is they'll reject that application for any small discrepancy because they're under a lot of pressure to get them done on time. So I would start these as soon as you can before once you know what your project's going to be. So to do an air permit application, you're going to give them a lot of information about your site and your company and what you're going to do there. You're also going to have to do emissions calculations. You're going to have to use available Environmental Protection Agency emission factors to determine how much probably particulate matter is the primary pollutant we have, is going to be emitted from the site. And if you're unlucky, you might have to do what's shown on here, and you have to do air modeling. Air modeling can be expensive. And if it shows that you're going to exceed a national ambient air quality standard, you may have to put in some sort of control devices. Your emissions may require you to do that too. So something to start way ahead of time because that can greatly impact your bottom line as well, or your project. Now, this is an environmental issue, but sometimes I just get stuck with permitting items. It doesn't matter what the regulatory agency is. So I threw this in there because you may end up getting stuck with it as well. The Federal Aviation Administration has an obstruction evaluation that you may have to complete. Now, they have this really complex formula depending upon your distance to an airport. Has all sorts of criteria, but the general rules, if your building is going to be over 200 feet tall or 150 feet within 20,000 feet of an airport, you may have to submit this obstruction evaluation criteria to the FAA. Now, when I talk about 200 feet or 150 feet, we're talking about the overall structure, not just your grain bin. So if your legs, head house, or something else is taller that may require you to submit this. Now, I haven't run across this, but at the end of the day, they could possibly deny it because you're too close to the airport or require some sort of lighting device on top of it. We've been fortunate and never been required to do that. And one thing to keep in mind when they say proximity to an airport, we're not talking about O'Hare Airport. We're talking about some pretty small airports. I've been shocked when I found out that the FAA considered certain grass fields that somebody lands a plane in occasionally as an airport. So you have to make sure you evaluate that carefully. So I mentioned the floodplains earlier. Depending upon the floodplain coordinator, which I see a lot of variability in, the local coordinators tend to ask for different things, but you may have to do a no-rise or encroachment certification. What that means is your project isn't going to cause the flood, because you're not going to displace the water and cause the flood to be worse because of your grain elevator. So you may also be required to flood-proof or raise up your occupied buildings above a certain level. And the other thing they might do is they might require you to offset your building. So if your building's going to displace 100 cubic yards of water during a flood, you can dig a sedimentation basin that's 100 cubic yards to offset that in a nearby area. The National Historic Preservation Act doesn't have a permitting policy for it, so there's nothing that you normally are required to submit to the State Historic Preservation Office, but there are a number of other permits that you may have to submit, and they will ask you to either submit something to the State Historic Preservation Office or they will submit something for you. The Corps of Engineers will do this. They'll ask for comment from the State Historic Preservation Office, and that's why it's important to address that early, because you never know who's going to send something to them. And these are interesting projects when you get them. The State Historic Preservation Office, depending upon your location, and I don't have a good understanding of when they're requiring this or not, but they may require you to do a Phase 1 survey. And they'll go out to the site, and they're looking for certain indicators. Sometimes they're just looking for ridges that stick out from the normal topography. And they're going to do some shovel tests and dig down and see if they see any archaeological sources. And if you're unlucky and they find something, you're going to have a couple options. You can either avoid that area, build somewhere else, or you can do further study to verify whether it's truly a archaeological source or historic place. They're going to go out and they're going to dig a pit, and they're going to sift through all that. I haven't had this delay a project yet, but these can be really time-consuming and cause a lot of problems. Another requirement that doesn't have a permit is the migratory bird survey. So bald eagles and migratory birds aren't on the threatened and endangered species list, but there are a number of federal laws that protect them. And this is probably one of the most missed, overseen regulations that people don't know about. But technically, before you take down trees on your site, you need to do a nest survey for migratory birds like eagles. Now, these aren't small nests, but so you're going to see them in large trees and normally only close to waterways, but you have to do a survey, and if you find them, even if it's not an occupied nest, you need to you're not allowed to take that down. You need to either avoid that area, keep 660 feet away as the general criteria, or you may have to avoid doing construction during nesting season, or you have to put some sort of landscape buffer in. I mentioned the environmental site assessment earlier, and that's a non-obtrusive evaluation. They're not digging any holes or taking any samples. But you may want to do a site assessment and investigation. Now, this doesn't have to be before you buy the property, but you should do it. You may want to do it before you do construction. And what you'll see is people will do this at the same time they do the geotechnical evaluation. Sometimes you can use the same company and they can do the testing at the same time, and you can save a lot of money. Now, this isn't required by law, but if you have some sort of issues identified in your Phase 1 environmental site assessment, you may want to do this for a number of reasons. One, if let's say they found fertilizer or gasoline or diesel, and your operations are going to have fertilizer or gasoline or diesel, you may want to do some testing to establish a baseline. Because at the end of the day, if somebody comes back and they say, well, there's contamination here, you need to clean it up, you can show that, hey, this was the level of contamination when I bought the property, and it's not higher than it was then, so you can get out of having to clean that up. If you've got railroads in your property, it's another reason people often do this. The railroads are pretty onerous about when you turn a lease back over to them, they may come back and make you do an assessment, and they may make you responsible for contamination, so you want to show what it was when you began operations. And then if you're going to have offices or you have any sort of volatile compounds that were identified as contamination, when you're running fans or you have an office building, sometimes that creates a negative suction, and it'll draw up those chemicals into the buildings or into your silos. So sometimes people want to do that, and you may end up putting a vapor mitigation system. That's a lot like a radon mitigation system. It basically just draws it out and keeps it from going into your buildings. And threatened and endangered species surveys. Hopefully you've coordinated with your state office on this. This is very timing specific, as I mentioned earlier. Hopefully you can avoid having to do this, but if you can't, you may have to do a survey. You'll have to have a wildlife biologist come out. And I get harassed the most over threatened and endangered species out of any of the things that I do and are made to do. One of my favorites is one of the projects we worked on was if you're in western Kansas, western Nebraska, South Dakota, you're in the swift fox area. It's a threatened and endangered species, and we had to have a wildlife biologist come out, and they did a den survey. They looked for any holes in the ground, and around all the holes in the ground that they found, they had to go and take this sand and glycerin mixture, spread it out around those holes, and then waited a day or two, and then they looked at the tracks to see if any of them were swift fox tracks. Fortunately, none of them were, but didn't prevent all my coworkers from volunteering to go hunting and take care of that issue for me. But this is very species dependent. Every endangered, threatened species has a different type of survey, timing issue, and that's why you really need to get on that up front and talk to the regulators. Generally, it's not something you can't get around, but you need to plan for it ahead of time. And finally, the wetland delineation and permitting. This is one of the more controversial issues that we deal with. There's lawsuits. The Corps of Engineers just recently issued some guidance, and they're being sued again over that. One of the keys to remember is you have to do this delineation seasonally. So you can't go in the middle of winter, because if it's snow-covered or there are any plants at the site, they're not going to be able to do the delineation. So you have to do timing on this as well. The other key thing to keep in mind is not to make any sort of early decisions on whether it's a wetland or not. This looks great. People look at this and say, okay, that's a wetland. But one of the reasons this is so controversial is you may not have any water at all and have a wetland on your property. This is one of the things I tell people all the time. I don't always try to make sense of the regulations. We just try to comply with them. Why would a wetland be wet? That's just how the regulators think of things. So you need to have somebody who's probably a wildlife biologist or knows the plant life in your area come out to the site, and they're going to look for 3 criteria. They're going to look for hydric soils. They're going to do a shovel probe, and they're going to survey the soils and determine if it'll support wetland plants. They're going to look for wetland plants, and they want a dominant wetland species in each area or canopy. So they're going to look at the ground, they're going to look at shrubs, and they're going to look at trees. All of these are different wetland-type plants that they might have. And finally, they're going to look for water source, and this is one of the most controversial things. If you look at these trees, the 2 big trees in the foreground, and see how the color changes, it looks like it has moss. Well, that's an indication of the ordinary high water mark. And basically what the Corps says is that's an indication that there's water here periodically, even if it's not there all the time. And that's one of the things they're being sued over recently. But that's an issue that somebody who's an experienced at is going to find and look at. And then if you have wetlands on your site, obviously the first thing you want to do is try to avoid them. And if you can't, you may have to submit a permit. Now, depending upon the quantity of wetlands you're going to disturb, you may be able to get by with a nationwide permit, which is a real easy, limited time frame, may only be 90 days. But if you have to do an individual permit, we could be talking, I know in one state they said 1.5 years to get that permit. So trying to avoid them is important. when I talked earlier about doing that desktop survey for wetlands, one of the things it's good to do as well is to track all the different properties that you look at, because they are going to want you to submit, if you're going to disturb a lot of wetlands, an alternatives analysis, which means you're going to have to show them that you looked at all different types of areas and you didn't just select the one with the most wetlands. Now, fortunately, they allow you to, when you discuss why you chose a particular site, you can take into account your obviously production issues like access to rail, farms, highways and things like that. But it's good to keep track of that information in case you have to do this permit. So that's all the things you need to do well in front of beginning construction. There are a few things you do either right before construction or maybe even during construction. The construction stormwater permit is one of them. If your project is going to disturb an acre of ground or more, you're going to need to submit a construction stormwater permit to the state. Now, most states, this is a 7 to 10 days. There are a few states that have 30-day time frames. One of the issues with this, though, is that in a lot of the states, they are also going to want you to coordinate with the Historic Preservation Office and the Fish and Game or the Threatened Endangered Species entity. And that can take longer. In Nebraska, it's great because you are automatically approved once you submit it in 7 days. But what they don't tell you is that the Nebraska Fish and Game takes 30 days to review it and approve it, and they can't get you your construction permit until you get that done. So you got to give this a little bit of time. And we're talking about disturbing 1 acre or more. If you have a 10-acre project, you can't just divide it up into 11 parcels and say it's not disturbing 1 acre. They're wise to that. They look at the greater project development. A lot of home builders try to get away with that. They would have all these half-acre lots, and they would broken up into 30 acres, and they would say they don't need a construction stormwater permit. So the purpose of this permit is to prevent erosion and sediment. So you have to submit the permit application. You need to develop a plan which identifies the sediment and erosion control measures. So that's your typical silt fences that you see at these sites. And then during construction, depending upon the phase, you're going to have to do inspections weekly or monthly. And after every rainfall event, you get a half-inch rainfall event, you need to go out and inspect it. And one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is this permit remains until you get final stabilization. What that means is all the disturbed ground either needs to be covered with a building, concrete, like your stabilized pad, or a natural vegetation. And people forget to do this, and they don't account for this up front, and they leave this open soil out, and they can't close the permit, and they have to keep doing these inspections in perpetuity. So it's real important to make sure your contractors know that they have to put in a vegetative stabilization when they're done with the project, so you can close out that permit. Otherwise, you have this open liability. Excavation dewatering. Now, some construction permits cover excavation dewatering, and you don't need a separate permit, but some states don't have that in there. So if you've got a high water table or you get a lot of rainfall and you might have to put in a dewatering pump and discharge the water so you can do construction, you may need a permit for this. This permit has varying time frames. A lot of states have general permits that you can get in a short amount of time, but you will probably have to actually sample the water. They want to make sure you don't have a lot of sediment in it, and they may even have to send it in for analysis of sediment, oil, and grease. And you're going to have to fill out your monitoring report. You're going to may have to go online or submit information that shows what the concentrations and volumes of water that you discharged are. And finally, the last time you might do, this is typically during construction, you can do this towards the end of the project, is if you have impacted wetlands a certain amount, you may have to mitigate them. And what that means is you're going to have to build a replacement for the wetlands that you filled in. So you have two options. You can do on-site mitigation or you can do a wetlands bank. Fortunately, for grain elevators, if you have a rail loop on your site and you're not going to fill it all in with ground storage piles, that makes a great place to put in a mitigated wetland. You can build one yourself. The key here is that you probably want to take the soils that were in the old wetland and stage them on the side and then put them in your new mitigated wetland area. That'll help get your growth. The Corps of Engineers is going to want you to monitor this for a certain number of years, maybe 5 years, have people look at it, make sure it's growing appropriately. And they will probably require some sort of deed or covenant change that protects that wetland in perpetuity. You can't just build this and then 3 years later fill it in with something. It's got to stay forever. Your other option is a wetland bank. So if you can find one of these in the same watershed, you can actually just pay somebody. You can say, okay, we need a certain number of acres of wetland built, or we need to buy that many from you, and they will set those aside for you. It's a little nicer. You don't have to do as much, but obviously you have to pay them to do that. And typically what you'll see is if you're going to fill in 1 acre of wetland, they're going to want, usually it's a 2.5 multiplier. So you fill in 1 acre, they're going to want you to build 2.5 acres or buy 2.5 acres of wetlands. With that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
That's great stuff, Brian. I think while she's getting the next presentation loaded, thank you for the NGFA for having us here. So we'll be covering just kind of the Clean Air Act in general, is kind of focusing in on a small part that Brian was talking about. Initially, this was going to be about 60 minutes long, but I'll keep it down to probably less than 30 minutes so we can get to the break. The overview will be kind of Clean Air Act, potential projects that might need permitting, and then if we have time, also taking a look at the NSPS that an earlier speaker was talking about, the new source performance standards and what's been proposed just last summer as kind of an update to that standard. And you might notice a baseball diamond up in the right-hand corner. That'll keep track of how long we're coming along here, and we might have some baseball references later on. So the Clean Air Act, I really like this quote, is a complex and demanding enough to keep lawyers, engineers, and environmentalists busy for all their lifetimes. It seems to me that we have created a maze into which only the foolhardily attempt to enter, and from which only the exhausted, depleted, and defeated emerge. And this was from a senator who actually helped write the Clean Air Act. So he has a lot of good quotes, but thanks again, Brian, for letting me cover it. It's gone through about 3 amendments, 1970, 1977, and 1990. 1990 was the big one that came up with like the Title V and other areas that have made it just keep expanding and expanding. That Brian already covered. You know, we have regulations that are changing now daily, and it's almost exponentially increasing because of the 1990 amendments. The main item we want to talk about, though, is under the Code of Federal Regulations, kind of Part 52, covers new source construction. And primarily, the Clean Air Act covered, really large sources, and that's ones that emit over 100 tons per year or 250 tons per year, depending on where you're at in your attainment area or non-attainment area. Grain elevators are in that 250 ton per year category for attainment areas. Another thing that Part 52 said and the Clean Air Act said that we should all keep in mind is that, the Clean Air Act was to ensure that public health and welfare can be protected, but then it also is to ensure that economic growth can occur. So this was supposed to be a mechanism to make sure that we can keep building. But also attaining air quality standards. So a lot of times you'll hear people say attainment, non-attainment, unclassifiable. What does that mean? That talks about the area in a specific ambient air district. So like in Kansas City, you'll see that we actually have pretty clean air, as does kind of the whole area where we have grain elevators in the Midwest. We have pretty good air quality. And sometimes you'll hear people say NAAQS, that's National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And the Clean Air Act requires EPA to actually set these, but they have an independent committee that comes up with the actual standards. These will be like a concentration in an area for how many pollutants you can actually have that we can breathe in and still be healthy for the public to take in. What we have there is a picture of an actual ambient air monitor. You might see these around. If you're driving out in remote locations, there's a few around Kansas City as well. Brian touched on this, and I'll just skip over this real quickly, but when people talk about air permitting, it's not just one type of permit. There are many types of permits out there. There's construction, operation, there's many types of construction permits, there's many types of operation permits. And so they all have different thresholds, different requirements, and different triggers. it's been said a lot, so I'll just repeat it, but construction permits are needed before you begin construction. In general, what is construction? We have to define it. The Clean Air Act in most states, I would say, call it as initiation of physical on-site construction activities on emission units, which are of a permanent nature. So that would be maybe pouring concrete or setting footing, something permanent. These are things that you cannot do until you actually have your permit in hand or a waiver to begin that construction. And then operation permits are something that are usually required 12 months after you begin operation of the unit constructed and you already have the permit in hand. And I know we have a large group of folks here and people coming from a lot of different areas, and so it's great that so many people could come. But we can't really focus on each state because we wouldn't have time to do that. But I just want to keep in mind that each state has its own and permitting agency, because sometimes there are local districts within a state. They have their own techniques, mechanisms, the way of issuing permits and processing the applications. And so it's something to keep in mind is, you know, where you're at, and who's writing your permit is going to depend heavily how it's going to end out. So when we talk about emissions at your plant, what are those? What do we have to consider? What do we not have to consider? Just kind of in general, when we talk about emissions, these are usually like dust, fume, smoke, vapor gas, other gaseous or fluid particulate matters coming out of your stacks or from different areas. In grain elevators, we're usually talking about particulate matter, so that's short for PM. And before I move on to the next slide, but the PM will mainly come from hauling, receiving, handling, storing, drying, cleaning, and shipping grain. There's also combustion emissions to take into account, so that's when you're combusting natural gas or diesel or anything on site, and this will cause carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, greenhouse gases, sulfur oxides, and maybe some trace amount of HAP. So these would all have to be considered for permitting as well. CEU question here. So in general, the emissions of instruments are any stationary source of emissions or group of stationary sources of emissions. So sometimes it's not just your elevator or what you consider to be your elevator. It could be an elevator that's nearby. It could be a plant that's nearby. You have to take into account kind of the proximity and location of all the emission sources in a particular area. Take into account your industrial classification and the control and ownership of the different sources in the area. So if you maybe have a contract to give grain to another person or another entity nearby that also emits, sometimes you have to consider that entity as well when it comes to Clean Air Act permitting. Also, not all emissions are created equal. Sometimes we have stack emissions. That's primarily the ones that you'll see with limits in your permit, but then there are fugitive emissions too. These are ones that will be coming from a road, maybe a storage pile. Your dryers are oftentimes considered fugitive emissions. These are ones that cannot reasonably pass through a stack. And circling back to PM, PM has kind of many different phases, and since 1970 it's been regulated in so many different ways. And without boring you with the history, it really started out as just the filterable particulate pollution that you could see, so kind of the heavy suspended particulate. And then as more research was done since 1970, people started to figure out that the PM10 and PM2.5, and these are particulate matter less than the size of a hair. These are the stuff that you can actually breathe, and this is what EPA and state agencies started to focus on. So this was the one that was actually hurting humans. I mean, these are so small that oftentimes when you inhale them, it gets lodged into your lungs. And so this was the one that EPA was actually worried about. And PM2.5 also forms in ways that you can't see it. So after maybe you combust natural gas, it gets into the atmosphere, and these really light gaseous matter condenses into particulate matter of PM2.5. A baseball reference here, so if you build it, they will come from Field of Dreams. I think building is a great thing. It helps customers, profits, operational flexibility, but also when you build, you have to consider that, you know, changes can be public information. It can be in the newspaper, it can be visible from a roadway, and if it is, and you don't have the permit, then regulators could also be coming as well. Another CEU question. How should emissions be evaluated when considering if we need permitting? By a show of hands, who's heard of the term potential to emit? So this is kind of a very theoretical calculation that makes you want to hit your head against the wall sometimes, but it's taking into account if you have a piece of equipment and it operates 24/7, and you don't get to consider the add-on controls unless you have a permit or some sort of other regulation that is requiring you to operate that control device. So imagine maybe a dryer operating 24/7, which would probably never happen. But for potential to emit purposes and considering whether you need a permit, you have to consider as if it would run 8,760 hours a year. And when considering if you need a permit and evaluating potential to emit, people always talk about change. What's a change? What's happening at the facility? And the Clean Air Act really doesn't say what a change is. And so that can make this kind of difficult. It says what a change is not, but it doesn't really say what a change is. By the way, a change that kind of the Clean Air Act does say is not a change is maybe ownership adjustment, increase in hours of operations, or kind of a routine maintenance and repair. But ones that you might need to consider air permitting, and this is just a short list of them, there could be others. Building a new plant, of course, or if a new plant is coming nearby. Changing or removing pollution control equipment. That could be changing the stack location or changing the pickup point, changing your process flow, like in your process flow diagram. Maybe grain's going to be handled or stored in a different way. Maybe it's going to be cleaned in a different way. It could also be even changing your haul road routes, which seems a little bit crazy. So maybe you're changing the way that trucks are going to be coming in or going out, or I know we talked about paving roads earlier in another presentation. These are all things that could be considered on whether or not you would need to change your permit or apply for a new one. Essentially, if you have a previous permit application, and if you're changing anything with that previous permit application, it would probably need to be evaluated for permitting as well. I'll try to skip through these pretty fast because I think we are running a little bit behind, but every state has their own permit thresholds. These are kind of federal EPA major source construction thresholds, so if you trip these, you would have to go down the route of trying to submit a permit application to your permitting agency. This is Iowa's. They have a small unit exemption. Illinois also has some certain exemptions for grain elevators. Kansas, an interesting thing about Kansas is they have Ag Source PM considered as having a higher permitting threshold, so that's a good thing to kind of grow agribusiness in Kansas. Missouri has de minimis thresholds. If you're above these, you'll need to seek permitting from them. Minnesota has pretty straight tons per year potential to emit thresholds for permitting. I think Minnesota sometimes, I don't want to criticize their permitting agency, but they do move a little bit slower than other states, similar to Nebraska, I think. I think, states like Missouri, Illinois, Kansas try to move a little bit faster, but Nebraska and Minnesota have these kind of ton per year thresholds, and somehow their permitting seems to move a little bit slower than other places. South Dakota is interesting because I think they have the lowest permit thresholds out of anybody. They have something like 2 tons per year for an emission unit would have to be permitted. So they pretty much permit about everything in South Dakota. So something Brian touched on earlier, and I just want to reiterate, how long will it take to get a permit is dependent on a lot. So size and complexity of your project, the permitting agency that's writing the permit for you, and then also maybe your expert advice that's being utilized to submit your permit application. How long will it take to make an application? It'll depend again on those 3 things, but you do have to do emission calculations. You have to do a regulatory analysis to see what federal and state standards are going to apply to you. You have to fill out a lot of forms. Many times, not all the time, you have to do ambient air modeling, which we have a graphic up here for that. And then sometimes you even have to negotiate with your permitting agency to see what kind of application you should be submitting. And so after your permit application is deemed complete, which can take a while for your permitting agency to deem your application actually complete, they then have to process it to put your permit out on public notice. So it can take 3 to 12 months. It can be shorter or longer. Most agencies, I would say, are 6 to 9 months, but some do act a little bit faster. Some take a little bit longer. And then the public comment period is usually 30 days for these permits. That's the public to put in their input on whether or not they agree, disagree with the permits, have any issues with it. And then each permitting agency actually has a requirement to respond to all these public comments. And so, as you can imagine, if somebody was really challenging a permit and didn't want it to be built, and Sierra Club does this a lot of different environmental groups will challenge permits just to hold them up so that the state agencies can't issue the permits. I think this is a horrible thing. It then makes the project get held up for a very long time. So, when you're looking at permitting from conception to permit issuance, the best case would be maybe 4 to 5 months from when you come up with the project to when you actually get your permit in hand. And the worst case could be, a year or multiple years. But is there a way to expedite the process? There is, and this is why it's very important to consider, what state you're in, where you're at, and what regulations would apply to you. So there are, permits by rule. This is where we just submit a notice of applicability to the state. Maybe the state already has rules for grain elevators, so you don't actually have to get a permit. You would just submit a notice to them saying, this is what we're building, and just by rule, we'll have these limits. There's also registration or general permits. This is where you submit a general application, and then there's a general permit that's issued to you. There's also waivers and variances to construct. This is where, if maybe due to economic hardship or natural disasters, we need to build before a permit's in hand. So you can get a waiver to construct. Also to expedite the process, if you just have maybe permit meetings with the permitting agency, if you stay in front of them, try to say, hey, we need this permit right away. Keep talking with them, give them all the information they need to process the permit. I've even written permits for states so that they could just get it out the door quicker. That's, when we're up against a time crunch, we just have to get these permits as soon as we can. Another thing to keep in mind is if you have a good permit to begin with, maybe it would allow for future growth. So that would be also something that would expedite the process. You have a good permit already, and it allows for you to maybe add a dryer or change your roads or something like that. But if you have a flexible permit to begin with, that could expedite the process so that you don't have to go get another construction permit. Go the distance. What distance? That would be just say maybe the extra mile. When it comes to Clean Air Act permitting, understanding permit requirements can be difficult, but it's great to understand what's in the permit. Also, knowing all the applicable regulations, which can change on a daily basis. And then track future projects nearby so that we can, foresee these projects that might take months to years to permit. Am I doing okay? Okay. Real quick, permit contents and requirements. Once you get your permit, what's going to be in it? You'll see descriptions, capacity limits, compliance demonstrations like monitoring, record keeping, and reporting. Typical monitoring and record keeping is like grain throughput, hours of operation, control device, differential pressure readings, fugitive dust monitoring, device management plans like haul road or control device management plans. That would be how you're supposed to maintain your baghouse or maybe how you're supposed to maintain your haul roads. Maybe checking the silt content of your haul roads. These are all things that can lead to emission events or high emissions. Opacity observations, that's where you'd be looking at a stack or maybe an area to see how much light is transferring through it or seeing if there's any dust coming from it. Typical reporting requirements that you might see in your permit once it's issued. Maybe notice of beginning construction or operation, advance notice before you're going to be doing a stack testing, annual, semi-annual compliance reports, testing and monitoring, annual emission reports, excess emission events. There's going to be a lot. So I guess what we're trying to say is that it's not just a matter of getting the permit. Once you have it, there's going to be a lot of requirements as well. When we were talking about what you need to consider for maybe nearby sources, this is a graphic I showed at an ethanol production conference recently, and that is, so this is where the majority of grain or corn grain is made in the United States. And this is where all ethanol production facilities are located. So, I mean, that makes sense. You would put ethanol production right next or near a grain elevator. But then something to keep in mind is that to a regulator, they might try to consider it something that's maybe the same source for permitting, which could hold up a lot of things. Because if you have to be under the same permit as a plant nearby, it's probably going to be a more complex, a more difficult permit to deal with because they have a lot of different sources that, a grain elevator wouldn't have. So just a reminder to keep in mind when it comes to this graphic of, what is nearby your facility, keep in mind these single source considerations. Because, again, the proximity between locations, the industrial classification code, and then also common ownership can be all taken into account to consider whether or not you have to be one source for permitting and have one permit as opposed to separate permits. And then if we have time, it's okay, we'll cover the new source performance standards. These are under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act or Part 60 of CFRs. It's authorized EPA to develop standards. It kind of sets kind of the base for everybody, so everybody must achieve these standards. All the states that we talked about have all their different standards, but the CFRs and Part 60 and NSPS establishes this ground base for what everybody needs to achieve. Something else to keep in mind is even if your state has delegation to do the NSPS, EPA retains its authority to enforce it. The NSPSs are supposed to be updated every 8 years. The last time the NSPS DD for grain elevators was updated was 1978. It's been amended maybe 3 or 4 times in the past, but it was never actually updated completely. Who is affected? I think we all know this already. It's grain elevators, truck unloading stations, barge unloading stations, rail car, grain dryers, all grain handling operations if you're of a certain capacity. What is that capacity? Okay, CEU question here. That is, grain elevators are the ones that are handling all of this, but grain terminal elevator is the one you want to consider for NSPS DD and the new DDA. Grain elevator means any permanent storage capacity of 2.5 million bushels. So permanent storage capacity of 2.5 million bushels. There's also a lower threshold if you're at a certain area, like if you're located at a wheat or flour mill. It's 1.0 million bushels permanent storage capacity. But for the most part, I think most sources are under the 2.5 million bushels of permanent storage capacity threshold on whether or not you have to meet the requirements of NSPS DD or not. What are the requirements within DD? If you were to pull it up and you wanted just to read it straightforward, it might be a little bit confusing. But with bullet points right here, for the main part, the dryers have to have a certain design requirement, and that's for their plate perforations or their mesh on the screens. This is really the existing part. I'll try to get through this quickly so we can focus on the recently updated DD. So DDA, this happened last summer, June 27th. EPA proposed new NSPS for grain elevators as subpart DDA. So they just took, DD, and then they followed up and made a whole separate part DDA. And it wasn't actually published in the Federal Register until July 9th, 2014. So July 9th, 2014 is now a new magical date of when you're considered under DD or DDA, and that's if you modified or reconstructed or started construction after July 9th, 2014. According to EPA, then DDA is what applies to you. And as we'll talk about, what's in the new DDA, there's actually a lot. They updated it pretty heavily, and unfortunately, because as we get to the end, you'll see it's not for a whole lot of benefit, but there are a lot of new requirements. So there's new PM limits, there's new limits during startup, shutdown, and malfunction. There's additional testing, monitoring, record keeping, and reporting. And there's also a definition for temporary storage facilities, which is something that's new. Why did EPA do this last summer? Well, in part, they're supposed to update the regulation every 8 years. They never do that for all their NSPSs, but it's been about 40 years since, so maybe they felt obligated to do it that way. But also in November of 2007, EPA issued a letter talking about how you're supposed to consider these storage facilities and these temporary storage facilities, and that you should be considering them for applicability to NSPS DD. But a lot of people didn't like that. I didn't like it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense what the EPA was doing when their enforcement office and issuing how you handle these temporary storage facilities. And even the NGFA did petition the EPA to reconsider and rescind that kind of enforcement action. And the NGFA is also fighting in a good way to try and remove grain elevators from the NSPS altogether, which I think is a great idea. Grain elevators don't emit as much as other facilities when you consider boilers, turbines, and things that really emit a lot of pollutants. Another thing why NSPS DDA needed to be updated is that there was a court case with NRDC and EPA talking about emissions during startup, shutdown, and malfunction. and whether or not emissions should apply during those kinds of events, and essentially NRDC 1 saying there's no affirmative defense for having a startup or shut down a malfunction emission. So what are the new limits in DDA that just came out last summer? Again, these were just proposed. They're not finalized. It's been out for comment. A lot of people have commented, and EPA has not made a final rule yet, but these were just proposed last summer. That is zero opacity from dryers for the most part, unless you have a wire screen column dryer, and then it has to be less than 10%. I think this is a little bit of an unrealistic number. It's almost impossible to have 0% opacity. For those that don't know, 0% opacity is essentially nothing. You can't see any dust coming from your dryer, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's what's in the proposed standard, unless it is a wire screen column dryer, which has its own definition. Essentially, when you're transferring grain down through a dryer, then if it's between two woven screens as opposed to two perforated plates, if it's between woven screens, then it can have some opacity. Something that's new, even in the NSPS world altogether, is that it's trying to regulate portable equipment. So portable equipment has standards now. If it's at a temporary storage facility or anything like that, and that is, they're trying to say that 0% opacity can come from your portable equipment like conveyors or augers or front-end loaders and things like that are supposed to have 0% opacity. They also added barge unloading for drag conveyors, have an opacity standard as well. This is new. This was not in the original DD standard. We talked about a little bit about the compliance requirements during startup and shutdown. These are new as well. That's just saying standards apply at all times. Additional testing is a big deal. It used to be in the old DD that you would do kind of a one and done. You do your initial method 9, which is an opacity observation, and then you do your method 5 and 17, which is kind of your particulate testing where you put probes in the stack. You do it once. The new DDA standard requires that you do the method 9 once every year, and no more than 12 months in between each one. And then the method 5 and 17 has to be done every 5 years. So this is a big cost to folks. I mean, it used to be you just do it once and then you don't have to keep doing it over and over again. But now the new DDA standard has, requirements that go into perpetuity, and we have to keep doing more testing. Additional monitoring. There's weekly visual emission checks. There's also backhouse inspections every 6 months. These are all new that weren't in DD before. A lot more record keeping. I won't go through all the details here, and I'm sure you can see the bullet points afterwards. But record keeping that usually you would see in a permit, now EPA is putting into NSPS DDA, not in there previously. And additional reporting, which can be a little bit confusing too, because when you do a stack test now, EPA wants you to submit it to their ERT, their electronic reporting tool. This helps them keep a database of all stack tests that's been done. Then also anytime you have an excess emission event, for all these 0% opacity standards, anytime you go over 0%, you're supposed to report that to EPA as well in this new DDA. And the temporary storage facilities, which is also a big deal because this contributes to that magical number of 2.5 million bushels. You take into account your temporary storage facilities. What is a temporary storage facility in DDA? That is something that uses asphalt, concrete, or other comparable base materials. It has a rigid wall, also has adequate aeration and a covering. So if you have all 4 things bulleted there under the new DDA, that would be considered a temporary storage facility that you're supposed to consider towards your permanent storage capacity of the 2.5 billion number. So it's taken into account in kind of a funny way. So you have, it's more of a ratio of your temporary storage. So you have your permanent storage capacity, but then you also have to take into account kind of the ratio of your total amount of temporary storage facility divided by your 5-year max throughput, and that comes up with your total number of permanent storage now considering your temporary storage. It's kind of it's a strange way of doing it. If you have any questions, we can talk about that later. This is the one that, and this is the last slide, to talk about NSPS DDA. So it's going to affect a lot of folks, over 900 grain elevators. The initial capital cost is close to $1 million. The ongoing annual cost for compliance is estimated to be about $1.1 million. And this is not a misprint. EPA says that the amount of PM reduced annually is only 31 tons. So that's not very much. When you're talking about other regulations that EPA does, they usually talk about hundreds of thousands of tons that are going to be reduced by regulation, and here we're talking about 31. So it's too bad. The rule's not final yet, but hopefully they do heed NGFA comments and other things like that, such that DDA doesn't come into effect. With that, yeah.